Late 18th century. The French Revolution unleashed a storm. Monarchical power collapsed. The aristocracy fell. For the first time, the people held the power to change the nation. Yet women were excluded. Olympe de Gouges stepped forward. She argued that women should have equal rights and the vote as men. 2 years later, she was executed for treason. But what if, this time, she had succeeded? How would the world have changed? In the first stage, we will discuss if women had gained the right to vote in the late 18th century, which parts of history would no longer exist. First, democracy would have been gender equal from the beginning. The 1791 French Constitution was drafted by men. Though it claimed to guarantee liberty and equality, it applied only to male property owners. Women had no right to vote, nor could they run for office. But if women had gained suffrage at that time, the 1791 Constitution would have included a clause on gender equality. Women would no longer be mere spectators, but would participate in legislation and governance. Reformist women like Manon Roland would no longer be just the politician's wife, but would take seats themselves and write legislation. Female legislators and political groups would have emerged in the 1790s. The word people would have truly included the entire nation from then on. Second, women's rights to education and employment would have advanced earlier. In the early 19th century, women were still confined to domestic roles. Even those with great talent struggled to enter universities or pursue professional careers. Sophie Germain once disguised herself as a man to pursue learning. Caroline Herschel was regarded merely as her brother's assistant. But if women had gained citizenship rights since the Revolutionary era, they would have had legitimate pathways into academies, laboratories, and courts. Society would have been forced to rethink the value and role of women. From embroidery needles to microscopes, from the household to the public sphere. Early female scientists would no longer be rare exceptions, but would have paved a broader path for future figures like Marie Curie. Gender boundaries would have loosened much earlier. The image of women as thinkers and professionals would have formed earlier. Third, the abolitionist movement might have succeeded earlier. France briefly abolished slavery in 1794, but in 1802, Napoleon reinstated slavery to maintain the colonial economy. Haiti endured years of war before finally achieving independence and abolition. But if women had been able to participate in politics at the time, Olympe de Gouges' anti-slavery stance would have gained institutional support. France might have taken a firmer anti-slavery and anti-colonial position. Not only would it have rewritten the history of the Caribbean, it might also have pressured slave economies like Cuba and Brazil. The system of black slavery might have been abolished globally. Before the 1820s, the concept of human rights would have entered international politics much earlier. Fourth, the feminist movement would have shifted from the margins to the mainstream earlier. In the 19th century, feminists were mostly seen as fringe figures. Their demands took decades, even over a century, of struggle to be partially realized. Mary Wollstonecraft published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792. But during her lifetime, she saw little response. Susan Anthony, Clara Zetkin, and others also fought in the late 19th to early 20th century. But if women had stepped onto the political stage as early as the 1790s, these ideas and actions would have taken shape earlier and spread more quickly. Women's suffrage would no longer be a century-long struggle and might have been widely achieved in Europe and the Americas before the mid-19th century. In the second stage, we will explore, if women had gained the right to vote in the late 18th century, how history might have unfolded. First, war and peace policies would have leaned toward restraint and diplomacy. If women had political representation before the Crimean War or before World War I and had had sufficient political representation, they might have favored diplomacy, compromise, and peace in policymaking, making war no longer the only option. This does not mean that women are inherently peaceful, but rather that political diversity would offer more solutions, preventing a single path of military expansion. Second, the global process of gender equality would have advanced by a century. There would have been no need to wait for the US in 1920, France in 1944, or Switzerland in 1971 to grant women the right to vote. If gender equality had been achieved in the late 18th century, feminist thought would no longer be the cry of a minority, but a mainstream voice within the system. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex might not have appeared earlier, but its core idea, gender as a social construct, might have taken root as early as the mid-19th century. Third, culture and thought would have become more inclusive. 19th century Romanticism and modernism would not have been shaped solely by Hugo, Tolstoy, and Nietzsche. Female writers and thinkers would have emerged alongside them. They would have brought different perspectives on emotion, politics, and ethics, broadening the boundaries of human thought. The history of literature and philosophy would no longer be exclusively male. Fourth, the archetype of modern women would be drastically rewritten. Starting from the 1790s, female leaders, thinkers, and reformers would have been active in the public sphere of France, the US, and other European countries. The notion that women equal motherhood and obedience would have been redefined. The list of heroes in history textbooks would have begun to feature more women's names from that point on. The world would look completely different from what we see today. History is a one-way river, but we can think upstream. If that woman who once stood before the guillotine had succeeded in changing this land, the civilization we know might never have existed. And we ourselves might be living in an entirely different world. The courage of one woman, a single declaration and a cry, can be enough to change the entire world.